Dinesh D'Souza, Larry Elder, and many more are coming to Freedom Summit Chicago 2017 on November 11th. Get your tickets today at freedomsummitchicago.com.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. It's Criminal Justice Week on Chicago's Morning Answer. We spoke with Fordham Law Professor John Pfaff yesterday. And this next gentleman we're going to speak with was featured prominently in the documentary I've referred to a couple times on this show in advance of the guests we've had on this week, and will continue tomorrow. Actually, we'll have the documentarian himself, Eugene Jarecki. The documentary is The House I Live In, and it explores the criminal justice system from a lot of angles. Not every angle, but a lot of angles, because there's a lot of players, there's a lot of institutions, and it's complicated. And it's specific to the drug war launched during the Nixon administration and how it's been prosecuted over the intervening 4.5 decades. I want people to kind of be thinking about the implications of something John Pfaff said yesterday. And this is writ large with the prison population, not just with drug offenders. The idea that, yes, we want to punish people. That's part of justice. It's supposed to be restorative as well as retributive. But this idea that even a violent criminal is convicted and sent to prison, therefore we wash our hands and we say, okay, well, we're done with that predator. The average prison term, 4 years, not 30 years. Right. So people are going to cycle out of prison. And that's part of the discussion, too, thinking about how we want to treat different classes of persons who commit crimes.
And a fourth of them, they return to prison.
Well,
because there's no rehabilitation.
Well, there's the recidivism rate. I think it's higher than that, depending on the crime. But yes, and I think you start from the premise, at least I try to, that very few people are born drug dealers. Very few people are born drug abusers. Yes, are people born where there is something mentally deficient and they're sociopaths and society needs to be protected from them?
And then there's a genetic makeup where you might be more prone to drug addiction or alcohol abuse.
So there are examples of that, but but that doesn't explain the 6 million odd individuals in state and federal prisons. So with that, I want to turn to our guest. He is Professor Carl Hart. He is the chairman of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. He's also the author of the book High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery that Challenges Everything You Know About Drugs and Society. Professor Hart, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I appreciated you being featured in The House I Live In, and some very poignant moments, too, for those who haven't seen it. I, again, encourage people to see it, including being reunited with your son and the self-reflection that was captured nicely by Eugene Jarecki in the movie. And I wonder if you could explain a statement that you made in the film, and I think you've made previously in some of your other work, that we should pursue drug policy consistent with science. What do you mean by that?
Well, I wrote a whole book on it called High Price, and so if people want to delve into this deeper, you can understand it from that perspective. It's simple. Just any public policy, not only drug policy, should be based on evidence, based on science, facts, and not anecdote and people's sort of personal feelings. That's a simple sort of thing. And we know quite a bit about drugs. We know quite a bit about drugs, the drugs that people use recreationally, because your tax dollars support research to understand these drugs. So people like me, who also is a research scientist, we give thousands of doses of drugs like crack cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, heroin, as part of our research to understand better what these drugs do. That is, under what conditions we can expect negative effects and under what conditions we can expect positive effects. And we also give these drugs to better develop treatment for people who may be struggling with drug addiction. So we know quite a bit, but that knowledge hasn't been translated into public policy.
Well, who knows more about marijuana, scientists or the feds?
don't understand that the two are not necessarily separate, because the Fed funds much of the work with marijuana, and many people who are scientists work in the federal government.
Well, give me an example of a policy that would be consistent with the science we know to be true that is not currently drug policy in this country.
Well, when we say things like, for example, some drug is more addictive than anything we've ever seen, that's just simply not true, and it leads us to restrict those drugs in certain types of ways, in ways that are unrealistic and sometimes. But let me just give you a specific policy that's related to what the country is concerned today when we think about opioids, the concern with opioids. We are concerned about not so much addiction, although addiction does occur, but that's a relatively low rate, even though the media has exaggerated this. But the major concern we're concerned with is overdose death. Right. And people are dying from opioid-related deaths because in some cases they get they may get unknowingly a drug called fentanyl, which is about 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. They may think that they have heroin and they snort too much or they inject too much, thinking that they have heroin, and they set themselves up for an overdose, and sometimes they die. Now, one way we can deal with the adulterants being put in drugs is to simply set up in neighborhoods and communities free drug testing purity centers, such that people will know what is in their various drugs that they may purchase. Yeah, drugs are illegal, but if the goal is to keep people safe and live another day, this is a simple fix. This is a fix that occurs in other countries like Spain, like the Netherlands. These countries are more concerned about keeping their people safe. And we can do the same thing here.
So that sounds like, would a government agency do that, where they'd screen the drugs to make sure they're safe?
Well,
or the FDA?
You don't need I'm talking about illegal drugs that people may purchase on the street, the ones that they are dying from. You don't need a government agency. You can set this up in cities. You can just have, there are, for example, in Chicago, University of Chicago, there are labs at the University of Chicago that can do drug testing to test to see if these drugs, street drugs, contain adulterants, and they can inform people in the city, in your city. This is not complicated.
Oh, so you're not talking about like a decriminalization centers for the administration of these drugs. You're talking about essentially connecting scientists to what's happening at the street level so that information can be disseminated.
Yeah, they don't necessarily have to be scientists. They just need to know how to run the machine.
Right, okay.
And inform people. But we certainly can talk about decriminalization. We can talk about all those sort of things, because those are other strategies that we can implement. But I was just talking about one area. If we're talking about
one
keeping
aspect
people
of it
alive.
Yeah. I want to take a step back and talk about drug laws more generally. I thought there was an interesting argument that was made in the documentary about the history of drug laws in this country, and the suggestion is that drug laws have been targeted at particular new groups of people in this country. It was first going after opium dens with the Chinese, and then it was drug laws targeting Mexicans, and then the way Eugene Jarecki treats African Americans is essentially as an immigrant group that migrated to the north. Then it was targeting blacks, and now talking about the meth problems, it's whites. So kind of every group gets its turn depending on the particular perspective of the powers that be, is the argument that's made, and some of the sentencing disparities and penalties associated with different drug law violations was the evidence presented. I mean, is that a fair representation of the history of drug laws in this country, in your opinion?
Well, it's bordering on fairness, but be careful with this immigrant sort of story. Understand too that documentary films they only have a short amount of time to tell a story, and so the filmmaker is restricted it's not documented. I mean, it's not necessarily that people are immigrant groups. It is mainly out groups, people who are on the outs of a society. That's the major concern.
Right.
So when we think about, like you started the segment off by saying that the war on drugs began in '71 with Nixon. I know that's what people say, but that's just not true. The war on drugs really began in earnest in the United States in 1914 with the first national drug laws banning opioid products as well as cocaine, and that was specifically targeting black people and targeting certain groups of Chinese folks. But so they targeted these sort of laws, or the enforcement of these laws targeted these groups in part because they were despised, and it was just one policy that went after the despised group. We can think about other policies that may go after despised groups or groups on the margins. That's just how law enforcement works in general, in part because that's where you put most of your law enforcement resources. You put the police in these communities, and what do you expect to find besides some crime? I mean, that's just how it is. I live in a fairly middle-class neighborhood, and we don't have law enforcement oppressively enforcing laws like they might be in some other communities.
But let me ask you this though. And I take your point about the drug war starting with Nixon, but kind of the modern incarnation of it that's really, it seems to expand it. With respect to what's happened over the last 45 years, one of the things that Michael Javon Fortner, per his research over at CUNY, has found, going back to the Rockefeller laws in New York, where there really was a crackdown on drug use, it was middle income and aspirational black families that wanted stiffer drug penalties because they wanted the gangs and the associated drugs out of their neighborhoods. It wasn't like this was Nelson Rockefeller's great insight into the human condition. He was responding in part to political pressure from black families. So is it more complicated than just kind of the powers that be versus the other?
Well, no, be careful there, because that research that you just cited is short-sighted in that black people at the same time were asking for jobs, better education, a wide range of things in the community. They didn't get those things, and they also asked for making sure that the community would be rid of criminals, and the only thing they got was that sort of enforcement of drug laws. So that's not entirely an honest or an objective analysis of what happened. I mean, even today, there are people, black folks, just like white folks in this country, or just like Asian, just like Latino folks. They want to make sure their neighborhood and their communities are safe.
Right, of course.
That's today. But to single out like black folks with this sort of the war on drugs, that's just simply, I mean, there were black people at that period during the Rockefeller law time, 1973, when it was passed. There were black people who absolutely were in support of that law being passed, just like there were prominent black people in support of the law that punished crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. There were people like Charlie Rangel, who was a longtime congressman from Harlem.
Yeah.
A lot of Jesse Jackson, Chicago's Jesse Jackson, played a prominent role in making sure that the crack powder law got passed. A number of these folks, but please understand, they were also advocating for other things.
No, of course. Yeah, of course.
People make mistakes, and people have since said, yo, that was a mistake. We need to do something about it. And it has taken forever for anything to be done about those sorts of things.
Well, so if you were, redesigning the criminal justice system from the ground up, at least as it pertains specifically to drug laws, so much time is focused on minimum mandatory sentencing, prosecutorial discretion. That's a focus of particular Professor Pfaff's work. The disparities in sentencing, as you were describing, crack versus powdered cocaine. Would it be what you just described at the outset, just kind of science-driven policy that focuses on treatment and information, and less of the criminalization, even with funding for addiction treatment as part of it, or how would you conceive it?
Yeah, we have to be careful with this treatment versus criminal justice frame. That frame misses the vast majority of people who use drugs. The vast majority of people who use drugs don't have a problem. They don't need treatment. They don't need law enforcement. So I would start there. I would take a step back and think about the fact that, okay, people are using drugs. People have used drugs since humans have inhabited the earth. And so why are we punishing people so harshly for this activity? And I would reconsider the punishment. And I would, first of all, decriminalize all drugs. That is, I would treat drugs just like we treat traffic violations. People may receive a civil penalty or a fine, but they will not receive criminal sanctions. So that would just stop all of those types of arrests. This is what has happened in about 20 countries around the world, including Portugal, the Czech Republic, Spain, a wide range of countries, and they don't have large numbers of people in their jails for drug-related violations, as we do in this country. In part, we have people in jail for drug-related violations, or we arrest people where they face criminal sanctions because we have this unrealistic view about what drugs do and don't do to people.
He is Professor Carl Hart. He's the chairman of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. He's also the author of the book High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. Professor Hart, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.